concept of Miami Beach being flooded and overgrown with corals, that's not an apocalyptic vision. If we keep warming the planet and the sea levels rise, you can't build a better artificial reef than Miami. We are Coral Morphologic, and we are a hybrid art and science endeavor based out of Miami, Florida. We've been best friends since we were in middle school. The morphology of an animal pretty much describes its physical characteristics. And so this is how science in corals gets done, studying skeleton, studying how many tentacles. These are what create species in the past. Nowadays, we have DNA. The coral as an organism, as a symbol, is the perfect hybrid between art and science. They're these animals that are the most naturally fluorescent organisms on the planet. Corals are living on a completely different, slower time scale. And so a theme that we work with a lot in our practice of documenting these corals involves the perception of time. If we can set up a camera and observe corals over a long period of time, then you really start to observe the hidden lives of these creatures. What looks like an inanimate object that is not moving on its own volition is in fact very active when you speed things up. In Natural History Redux, the idea really was to only feature invertebrates from South Florida. We're not trying to go super exotic into, Australia, Indonesia. Let's focus on what's right here at home, and let's film it, and let's see what happens. And it was really magical filming a lot of those. We were having to create our own studio equipment. We were having to create our own DIY aquariums or ways to film things in very small spaces. We didn't go to film school. But when the digital SLR comes along that has HD video capability, and we can use macro lenses, and we can do all the things that we're used to from a photographic perspective, that changed everything for us. We challenged ourselves. If we want to become filmmakers, we got to do one every single week. Because we got to find an animal, we have to film it, we have to make a soundtrack.
All the soundtracks are interpretations of the video that I'm watching.
Jared composes music for a very specific purpose. It's an ambiance.
We complete the video, then watch it, get a vibe off it, record the creature if I can. We'll just create some sounds based upon those samples.
A lot of that soundtrack is darker. It's dark.
Yeah, the ocean really isn't that.
Or it can be a horrific place.
It's a horrific place. Like, for example, in one of the videos, the Purple Forest video, there's this little crab on this piece of macroalgae, and it's a decorator crab. So literally, the crab has decorated himself with the macroalgae, so it's also a purple crab. And there's little flea-like shrimp unwittingly lands on this crab's head in about 10 seconds. Like, the crab just goes up and eats this little guy.
Bruce Lee style, just eat it. And then he's just back to, going through the algae.
And that's just what it is.
A living coral is a community on the microscopic scale and macroscopic scale. Where we see worms, we see crustaceans, we see fishes living in corals. Scientist puts a coral under a microscope and can see all the different microorganisms that live there naturally, symbiotically as a community. The corals form reefs. Coral reefs and humans have their own symbiosis. In many ways, whether it's here in South Florida or in a tropical island nation, people are dependent on reefs for their source of food, for protection from storms. In tropical nations that collect marine life for the aquarium hobby, the reef is a source of income. It provides a tremendous incentive to island nations to protect their reefs, their natural resources.
In our exploration of Miami's coastal waterways, we've encountered at least 4 different undescribed species unknown to science. These 4 particular species are all zoanthids, a type of soft coral that is in its own order that's basically overlooked by mainstream science. These are the Miami Vice zoanthids. We named the Vice zoanthids based on a particular color morph that is beautiful sky blue and neon pink center, and it looks like the Miami Vice colors. It took us years to figure out how to grow these animals reliably. And it has basically been a currency for us. And this is what we have been supplying to aquarists all around the world, also universities, public aquariums. And that is what really has provided us more income than any grants, any other art or multimedia project over the years, because we're the only ones that can do it.
What interests me, and it's a discussion I've had with Colin a lot, is these colors. Why do corals fluoresce? This subject is still a mystery.
It really wasn't until the 60s when people started to recognize that corals were fluorescent. And I'll never forget, I was 16 years old, and of course to go to any aquarium store in the 90s in New Hampshire, you had to drive 2 hours, and I just got my license and I drove to an aquarium store and I saw corals for the first time under blue actinic light. This blue actinic light is what causes the corals to fluoresce, and so it was the first time that I saw fluorescent corals, and it just, that was that.
If you go scuba diving during the day and go deep, you don't need flashlights. If you're in clear water, whether it's clear blue water or clear green water, once you're down about 100 feet, and even more interesting when you're down maybe 120 and you're a little bit narked, all the corals are glowing. So you're under the influence of nitrogen narcosis, and all the corals around you are these brilliant colors. It's a very interesting experience. All the reef fishes are seeing this if their eyes are sensitive to fluorescent light, and what scientists tell us they are. There's something going on. Somebody is sensitive to this fluorescent light, but we don't fully understand it yet. And we are definitely seeing it and appreciate it.
A lot
lot of the ideas that guide the way they grow the corals and the way they shoot them, those are all choices that they make. It's not like they grow in this way that you see them in the videos. They're curated and presented in a certain way. There's something really intense about your art being a living thing that you clone, and then you provide the context for it.
They have invested in some good equipment and put in some hours to getting things right. Not only that, they've changed the presentation of their work in a number of ways. Most recently, we completed a project at Port Miami where we wrapped 18 parking ticket booths with images of these zoanthids that they have been documenting, native to Miami. It starts on this very beautiful aesthetic level, and then it goes deeper into informing people a little bit more about the things that are growing around the port.
September of 2010, we were asked by Naomi Fisher and Jim Drain whether we would be interested in being a stop on their Weird Miami tours.
My wife and I went on a tour called a Weird Miami Tour. I didn't know where we were going. One of the places we went to was the home of these two guys who were growing coral. The foyer, the dining room, the living room, the sunroom were beds of coral. And I looked at it and I thought, well, okay, this qualifies as Weird Miami. And they showed a video that they had taken. For me, was, you know, when you have that aha moment.
We had these projections on the wall, and it's like, is this something that you could do for Art Basel?
And what it does is it just makes you think about where you are. It's unusual, it's out of place, and yet when you think about it, it's totally in its place. They were here first.
From very early on, the idea of projecting corals onto limestone was a really important part of our artistic practice. The cement and the limestone that comprise the buildings of Miami is actually fossilized coral from eons past when Miami was underwater.
If we went outside, I have beautiful keystone decking there, and many buildings, facades in South Florida are covered with it. And it is basically coral reef, about 125,000 years old, when the sea level was higher, about 30 to 40 feet higher.
To project the corals back onto these buildings, one, it references the geologic past, it references the technological present that we're in, and then it also references a potential future where if sea levels continue to rise, corals would have absolutely no problem coming right back in and cementing themselves onto
themselves.
Yeah.
Harold, do you remember? Do you?
We made this film called The Coral Reef for Dreaming Again, wherein we grew some live corals on some skulls in the lab, and then took time-lapse photography of the corals kind of blooming and closing. It takes place hundreds of years in the future, after Miami's completely underwater, and it's about the corals living on our bones in the same way that we live on their bones now.
It's part of our story as a city that's developing, you know, that this whole thing is a giant bed of coral that used to be underwater and it might go back in. I mean, that's a good story. It's poetic in a funny way.
In art and science, there are these animals that are the most naturally fluorescent organisms on the planet. Corals are living on a completely different, slower time scale. And so a theme that we work with a lot in our practice of documenting these corals involves the perception of time. If we can set up a camera and observe corals concept of Miami Beach being flooded and overgrown with corals. That's not an apocalyptic vision. If we keep warming the planet and the sea levels rise, you can't build a better artificial reef than Miami. We are Coral Morphologic, and we are a hybrid art and science endeavor based out of Miami, Florida. We've been best friends since we were in middle school. The morphology of an animal pretty much describes its physical characteristics. And so this is how science in corals gets done, studying skeleton, studying how many tentacles. These are what create species in the past. Nowadays, we have DNA. The coral as an organism, as a symbol, is the perfect hybrid between over a long period of time. Then you really start to observe the hidden lives of these creatures. What looks like an inanimate object that is not moving on its own volition is in fact very active when you speed things up. In Natural History Redux, the idea really was to only feature invertebrates from South Florida